Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this episode of the Accad and Koka Report. We are delighted to have two special guests today. Harold Pollack is the Helen Ross Professor at the Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy and Practice at the University of Chicago. He is co-founder of the University of Chicago Crime Lab, and he is co-director of the University of Chicago Health Lab. He's a committee member of the Center for Health Administration Studies at the University of Chicago. And his current NIH-funded research concerns improved services for individuals at the boundaries of the behavioral health and criminal justice systems. Past president of the Health Policy and Politics and Policy sections of the American Political Science Association, Professor Pollack has been appointed to 3 committees of the National Academy of Sciences. Dr. Robert Greyboys is back on the show. He's a senior research fellow and healthcare scholar at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He's the author of Fortress and Frontier in American Healthcare, and his work asks, how can we make healthcare as innovative in the next 25 years as information technology was in the past 25? Previously, he was a healthcare advisor for the National Federation of Independent Business, economics professor at the University of Richmond, regional economist and director of education at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, and sub-Saharan Africa economist for Chase Manhattan Bank. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we have you both on the show because Professor Pollack penned an article for Politico, to which Bob Greyboys responded, and I'm going to give the title of the original article by Professor Pollack. The title is Why Public Health Experts Aren't Reaching Conservatives on COVID. And the title of the response by Bob Greyboys was Conservatives and Public Health, a Warm Welcome into a Cold Climate. So let's, I think the titles are indicative of the content of the pieces, but let's start with you, Professor Pollack. Why should public health experts reach conservatives who, by definition, don't follow the science and are beyond reach? What are your thoughts? What did you write in your piece?
It's a good question. I should say, by the way, just to identify, this is, I assume many people in the podcast will not be familiar with me. I'm an emphatic liberal Democrat, and I'm sure that will come up in the conversation. But I'm also a social work and public health professional, and we need to have cultural competence and humility and ability to reach every group of Americans. And the death toll from COVID in red state America is enormous. We've had many tens of thousands of avoidable deaths, and it's just a tragedy. And I think that if we in the public health community and the social service community were able to operate within all of America more effectively, we might be able to prevent many of these deaths. And I also think that the other issue is that I think that every group of humans is vulnerable to groupthink and to collective error. And that's true of conservatives, it's true of liberals, it's true of every community. And within the public health community, the absence of conservative voices lowers the quality of our conversation. And I say this as someone who very much disagrees with many of the things that conservatives would say, but I think my students do not have the experience of sitting in the classroom with peers and really having to face a conservative perspective and take it seriously. And I think that has a very negative impact on not just our ability to reach conservatives, but our ability to identify our own errors and to think more rigorously in many areas of public policy. So I'm both those things were in my mind when I wrote that piece.
Okay, very good. I understand. In your piece also, you talk about the fact that conservatives, when they're in power, they lack depth in terms of understanding how policy works, because they don't have that exposure in academia,
Mhm.
and therefore they make proposals in policies. You gave the example of what was supposed to replace Obamacare, and it was a disaster of a policy. But isn't there something fundamentally that would fundamentally let me put it that way. Do
Mhm.
conservatives care to be in academia to talk about policy? I mean, don't they by definition want less policy or smaller government and
Well,
less of that anyways?
I think that conservatives, that's a big swathe of people, and I think that and I think there's conservative policy argument. Say let's take the argument: public employee unions have too much influence over local politics, and that's a very serious point. And if you say that to liberals, and you say police unions have too much influence over local politics, liberals will say, of course. If you say teachers unions, you get a very different reaction. And by the way, among conservatives, you just flip that. And I think that there are aspects of the conservative critique of liberal governance that are important arguments to be taken seriously. I also, and I think, by the way, when I say conservative, I should distinguish. There's people who are social conservatives and religious conservatives. There's people who have a more libertarian approach. There's different camps within American conservatism. Now, I should say, I'm going to say something that's acerbic about conservatism. I think as a political movement, American conservatism is in moral and intellectual crisis. And I think that there has always been strains of American conservatism that do need to be called out. I mean, President Trump, was an openly unworthy figure that conservatives supported to their discredit. And I say this as a liberal Democrat, but I don't think you have to be a liberal Democrat to say, here's a guy who made openly racist comments, who challenged President Obama's birth certificate. People who supported President Trump did something harmful that hurt the country. And I just want to be straightforward. I'm not, and I'm indicating my own position. And I think what has happened is the fact that this happened. I think you have this sort of moral crisis of American conservatism and the groupthink and absolutism of the American left. Those things reinforce each other, because I think if you say, what do my students who are progressives think of conservatives, they have an image of Donald Trump, of a relative writing incendiary things on a Facebook page that they think is that they don't respect, and they stereotype, and they're not ready for someone to say, I'm pro-life or I'm libertarian about government policy, and I want to have a serious discussion with you and explain why my view is really serious. And I think on the conservative side, the absolutism on the left reinforces the negativity in parts of American conservatism, and makes it easier for the more unworthy elements of American conservatism to thrive, because they can point to the excesses of cancel culture or of academic sort of the ways that the academic left sometimes oversteps and so on. So we have to deal with both those things. So I'm babbling, so I'm going to be quiet.
No, that's fine.
That's
Before I ask Bob to respond, let me just a couple of things. One is, implicit in the conversation so far is the fact that public policy circles and academia and is overwhelmingly on the left and liberal, right? And that's not controversial.
Mm-hmm.
But then, what is your what do you suggest to bring more conservatives into those circles?
I think we have to make a conscious effort to promote ideological diversity, and I think, by the way, law schools do that, in part because half of the American judiciary is conservative. So a lot of the people who are, say, Supreme Court clerks, come from a more conservative perspective, because that's. And when I talk to my colleagues in law schools, when I wrote a piece saying we should have affirmative action for conservatives, some of my liberal colleagues at law school say, we actually do that, and it's good. And because our students have to know what the conservative arguments are, because they're going to go out there in the legal world where those arguments are really important. And I think in public policy, if you're a sort of superstar and you're politically conservative, if you're Tom Phillipson or you're Casey Mulligan, um, you're going to do fine because you're obviously highly qualified for a lot of positions in academia, and people can criticize you, but you're qualified for the job. It's like a lot of forms of discrimination. If it's the person who's not quite at that level, where our own biases can lead us to discriminate without us being fully conscious of it. And I think when someone comes and gives a job talk in a public policy school or public health school or social work school, and it's not an ideologically congenial message for liberals, I think they come in and they realize, if I make a misstep, I am not going to get the benefit of the doubt. And I do not want people to feel that way. I want them to know that that they don't have to be any more worried than any other job candidate. If there's if they're giving an A- talk, that the fact that they are presenting a politically uncongenial message to many people in the room will not be weighed against them, and that they will not face distinctive competitive disadvantage because of their political perspective. And I honestly, I think we try not to do that, but I do not know that we are fully successful in doing that. And I think it's just groupthink and the way that every group of humans behaves that way.
Bob, what was your response to Harold's proposal?
Well, important thing is that subtitle, which maybe you read, which was a warm welcome into a cold climate. Cold climate I was referring to was public health in general. Mm-hmm. The warm welcome was Harold Pollack, because he wrote a fine piece, and I know his writings, and he's been writing the same things for years. So I think I said in the article that I'm sure that any conservative who went to the University of Chicago would get a very warm welcome in his classes and fair treatment. My concern was in the article that the same would not be true of many of his colleagues. I taught in various settings, including public health, for 19 years, 5 different universities. And I am what I am. Harold's an emphatic liberal. I guess I would say I'm probably an emphatic classical liberal, which I like because no one knows what that means, probably including me. But I had students across the board. I taught mid-career healthcare professionals. I had students who supported Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders and George Bush and Barack Obama and anyone else you can possibly name. And it was never a problem, except in the final year or two, I detected something, a great uneasiness going on. Mm-hmm. Things were kind of going off the rails. And I thought that was unfortunate. I never had any hesitation to say anything that was on my mind in 19 years of teaching. I know from colleagues now, graduate students and professors, who are scared to death to say the wrong thing, knowing that if I utter the wrong word, I will never get my PhD signed by the committee. So I best shut up for the years that I'm in grad school, which I think is a tragedy. How did we get there? So I was at the University of Virginia as an undergraduate in the 1970s. And the interesting thing is I was very politically active, and actually, interestingly, I was active on the Democratic side and pretty publicly so at that time. But I almost never knew my professor's politics. I had no idea. In later years, decades later, when the internet came out, I started Googling my old professors and finding, oh, that's interesting. That guy was a Republican. And, oh, that guy was a Democrat. That guy was a socialist. I never knew that when they were teaching me. I don't think that would be the case now. I think it's very much in your face. And if you don't agree with me, you'd best be quiet in my class. And again, I think that's a serious problem. I very much off on a distant corner, I was having a conversation with a colleague, actually a neighbor on the street. and I was talking about the all-volunteer army. My father was a soldier, World War II, drafted in 1941.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, I'm all in favor of the volunteer army. I think it's a good thing. I'm delighted that we have it, but I've always been aware of things that were lost in it. My father and his friends had to deal with everybody of all walks, of all different positions.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I was growing up, my parents would have election night parties, and their Democratic friends would come over and their Republican friends. Half of them would leave with a smile and half with a frown, but there was never any ill intent. And I think, I don't know, maybe the loss of that draft had an impact. I suspect it did, that we were allowed to go into our permanent bubbles and never deal with people outside of it. And again, it's a shame. I have learned a great deal from students whom I disagree with on most things. I think they've learned from me. I enjoy that, but I'm just, and I suspect Harold's the same way in his class. I just don't think it's the norm in universities now, and I think that's a serious problem. And Harold rightfully pointed out in his article, it's spilling over outside of the Ivy walls, in an inability, for instance, to talk to half of the American public about things as simple as vaccination. So it's a real problem, and I don't know easy way out of it, but it is a problem.
So would you take the offer if it was extended to you, if it had been, let's say, of joining a liberal policy think tank or group or academic faculty?
I would. In fact, when I was in the job market 8 years ago, I specifically went to some left of center places and said, so where am I? I'm really not emphatic anything. I'm not happy with either party or the level of discourse in either party. I don't vote with enthusiasm. I do vote. And I'm usually happier when the person I vote for loses, because then I don't have to be embarrassed for the next however many years. But again, I do learn things, and I have esteemed colleagues of all persuasions, and I like to talk to them. And I went to a couple of left of center places and said, I'm sort of libertarianish. I'm not a libertarian. And I could go into long explanation of why I don't fit neatly into any of these categories. I like, when I'm forced to, I'll say classical liberal, because it's sort of a head scratcher. No one quite knows what to make of it. But it's sort of libertarian-ish, but not reflexively anti-government, that sort of thing. And on some issues, I actually probably would find myself more in agreement with people on the left. I'm all over the place. But for anyone who was thinking of hiring me, they would think of me as something of a libertarian fellow traveler or something like that. But I went and said, I'd be glad to be the odd man out in your shop and be the one who challenges you and is challenged by you. I have been in that sort of environment before, and I enjoy it. Not everyone does. I actually had one outfit that said, gee, actually that would be kind of appealing. We don't have any positions now, but we'll
but this comes back to what has been mentioned already. By the way, Dr. Pollack, that was a wonderful essay that you wrote, and it really demonstrates a tremendous amount of insight, I think, into, and I think it's super hard for all of us who, it's so easy now with social media and Twitter and whatnot to enter into our own little bubbles and never ever talk to people outside of it. And so it's always a challenge for me, and I don't think I do it very well. I think it's much easier for me and maybe most humans to just kind of talk to people that support our views, and also then look for data that confirms our biases as well, right? So so let me start off by saying it was a very nice essay and very insightful. I thought it was great. But there's the abstract thing that I think someone mentioned on the abstract. Then I want to take it down to a practical level, to your field, ask you some questions to kind of demonstrate this. But on an abstract level, the thing I'd be worried about, given what the culture appears to be now, and you tell me if I'm wrong, we just, the Overton window is defined by this overwhelmingly left-leaning liberal class of intellectuals. And so what is deemed appropriate to be discussed, and this comes out in your essay too, right? And it comes out even in the initial opening of your of what you said on the podcast, right? That there are certain things that are okay. If you're conservative, there are certain meritable ideas with merit. But there's a lot of ideas that conservatives have that don't have merit. What if, and I would worry if I was a conservative in one of those liberal bastions and in that liberal castle, that, my goodness, what if I said something that is inappropriate, and now my head's going to be cut off? What do you feel like that Overton window is rapidly shrinking? You see, Ilya Shapiro, of course. There's this massive brouhaha. That's the most recent thing in academia. Can I ask you, in an abstract way, what you think about those concerns?
Well, there's a couple of different answers. One is something wrong, and the other is, what is the response when somebody says something that's wrong? And I mean, I'm a University of Chicago free speech absolutist, and in fact, I was interviewed by a student reporter who was puzzled by my response. She asked me, "What do I think of Steve Bannon?" And I gave a response which was PG-13, which I will not repeat here. And then he was invited to speak in a class, and she said, "Well, what did you think of this professor who invited him to come speak in the class?" And I said, "Well, that's not my place to have an opinion about that. And if he thinks that his students can benefit from a conversation involving Steve Bannon, then that's fine. That's his." Now, I must say, I also said if I were an African-American person in the dining hall who didn't want to make Steve Bannon a sandwich, I could kind of understand that too, because I'm not a fan of Mr. Bannon. And like Ilya Shapiro, I think that he made a tweet that I thought was inartful, and I can understand why people were quite offended by it. And the right response to that is to say, "Wow, that's a really offensive tweet. You should have said it differently. You should have." And the right response to bad ideas is to challenge them and rebut them. And one thing, I'm part of the University of Chicago ethos is anybody's got a right to speak, but boy, you also have a right to hear our critique of what you just said, and that can be delivered with bluntness. I mean, I think the American left in the 1940s, there were people who supported communism, on the American left, and part of what needed to be said was, that's these ideas are not worthy and they are harmful. And I think on the American right, there has been a sorting in American politics, and there's a group within the Republican Party that opposed civil rights legislation, that is very uncomfortable with demographic change in the country, and that has appealed to white racism as a political strategy. And that's not worthy, and we just need to be straight up about that. And it's not just Donald Trump. Donald Trump there is a long line of people, and I think by the way, liberals are aware of that history, and we need to be more aware of people like George Romney and the conservative Republicans who helped pass the Civil Rights Act. That there were always been other strains in American conservatism. But you look at William Buckley's famous essay endorsing segregation, and you look at Ronald Reagan and other conservatives who opposed this, the Voting Rights Act, things like that. That needs to be confronted, and just without demonizing people or shouting them down, but to say, there are ideas that there's a strain in American conservatism that needs to be defeated, and
that's fine. But that's I mean, that's fine. That's a reasonable position for a progressive. For progressive or something. I mean, that's a totally reasonable position to have, and it's a totally reasonable position for people on the American right, I guess, to say that, look, these are damaging. These are damaging positions for the American left to have, and they must be defeated. But my initial question to you was in terms of, a conservative coming into into a liberal sphere like public health, for instance, is that, look what happened to Ilya Shapiro, right? He's apparently on administrative leave, and I don't know what his number of days at Georgetown are, if they're numbered or not. How could any conservative come into a liberal public health sphere and have a conservative view on certain things without being afraid of being gotten rid of?
I think I think that's a legitimate worry. And by the way, I think that if you're in a conservative dominated space, I think that a liberal person would have the same worry. Any group of people that is in a position of dominance is both going to be tempted to use that dominance to exert that power over other people, and will find ways to justify that in their values. And there are, I mean, if I'm suppose that I'm an African American person who has fairly radical views about the history of American racism, and I'm saying some blunt things about the complicity of the great majority of Americans in a lot of these things. You can imagine I could be nervous if I'm in an atmosphere where I could be, where I could be canceled. And look at what local school boards are doing around, we're passing laws that a white student should not be made uncomfortable by things in the educational curricula in Florida and South Carolina, and I think some other places where they try to take frank teaching about the Holocaust out of the curriculum.
Right.
I think that is something that is universal, and we all have to watch out for. And I do think that the Shapiro case is a good example where I think as an institution we need to actually set a different example and say, it's not up. He made this tweet. He's a scholar here, and unless there's some evidence that he's doing something that is mistreating students in his classroom, it's up to us to deal with the argument, but not punish the person. And I understand where people are coming from who are concerned about disciplining someone who expresses that political perspective, and it is so I see your point.
So, right. I mean, if I may, sorry, and he's just on this topic. I mean, it seems to me that the problem, Professor Pollack, is that things that to you, and you mentioned them just earlier, you said that, for example, you said that there's a strain in the conservative movement that is in moral crisis and so forth. Yeah. And for you, it's absolutely crystal clear that certain positions taken or certain, or whether somebody is, if somebody is against that policy, then it must be motivated by racism, for example. And that's precisely the point of contention, is that once one group views the other's positions in moral terms, that the other group doesn't see it that way. And so, because I frankly, I think, do you think there could be non-racist reasons to be opposed to even the Civil Rights Act, or the Voting Rights Act that you mentioned? I don't know what the politics were back in the but there may be some legitimate reason to oppose these policies without necessarily being motivated by racism or prejudice.
By the way, I think the most common non-racist reason to oppose these acts among elected officials was political cynicism and the desire to appeal to people's racism, whatever your own views were. And there was a big segment. No, I certainly think, when I look at Robert Bork, for example, I think he's an example of someone who's a very serious intellectual, who deserves to be at an important position in American intellectual life, who had views that I strongly disagree with. Now, I think whether he should be on the Supreme Court and how people should view his confirmation where someone is a political actor is another question. But I think Robert Bork would be an example of someone that I think if he came and spoke at my school, I would expect that he would be taken very seriously as an intellectual leader, even among those of us who strongly disagreed with what he said, and that we would not caricature him as an immoral person because he held those views. And I certainly, but I mean, it is just a fact that there is a moral dimension to American politics around the oppression of African Americans, and that there was a profound injustice in our history, and that we had to confront that. And when politicians, when there was the great sorting of white race conservatives in the post-civil rights era from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, there were many Republican politicians who appealed to racism in their electoral base, and that's just a fact about American history. And we just have to, frankly, Jesse Helms would be an obvious example. I'm a public health researcher. I lived through the HIV epidemic, and I certainly saw that there were many elected politicians who basically said, the wages of sin are death. That gay people are getting HIV because they're engaged in immoral behaviors, and this is what they deserve. And stuff like that has to be confronted. And
there's no question that these things have to be, that there's, I guess, we'll move away from racism because it's such a touchy thing. I mean, I don't think anyone here is questioning the idea that America's racist history is questioned and all that. But it's this idea that you cannot now, it seems like there are certain planks you cannot oppose. You cannot oppose affirmative action and be, anyone who opposes affirmative action, it is a small step to accuse them of racism, as an underlying assumption. And so,
that's a good example. And I think your point is well taken.
And I'm Indian, I'm an immigrant, anyway, I'm not even gonna, but we'll get to your.
By the way, look at the obvious fact that Asian Americans face some level of discrimination in elite American universities.
Right.
I mean, like when I look at the Harvard case, right, I say, they clearly applied a differential standard to Asian Americans that put them at a competitive disadvantage compared to whites and other groups. And and I think liberals have. I think you were correct that affirmative action is a very uncomfortable issue, and that people are afraid to speak about it frankly because of that. And I think your point is well.
And unfortunately, there's an army of folks that are out there that are waiting to jump on folks that disagree and tag folks who.
Oh, I'm going to get some angry emails over the comment I just made. Yeah.
Oh no, well, they were bold to make it.
Yeah.
Moving to your area of, sorry, Dr. Rebois, go ahead.
I was trying to come in.
Yeah, I was going to say a lot of these issues are terribly touchy. I have friends who are grad students who are, again, scared to death. On the matter of Asians, there's this sense that's come out, and frankly, it's come out of the whole critical race theory literature, that Asians are white adjacent, white-adjacent, and I'm grappling with that in some writing I'm doing now. This sort of elites categorizing ethnic groups and engaging in, what I call taxonomic gerrymandering. That we're going to reclassify you and ascribe all of the ills of white America to you because you've done well. Your group has done well, so therefore there must be something wrong. And I think that's a serious problem. I don't want to go too far into the politics. I will say again, not trying to do the both sidesism, but for instance, I think both parties have a very serious strain of anti-Semitism that run through them, and I think to a dangerous extent in both sides, and that concerns me on a personal basis. It concerns me. And I was going to say, just alluding back to one of your earlier points and something that Harold was talking about with having Bannon in, One of the really memorable moments in my career as an undergraduate was we had a guest speaker on the campus at the University of Virginia, William Shockley, who invented the transistor and won the Nobel Prize and was a genius, but decided late in life he would become an absolutely awful eugenicist, one of sort of in the late stages of eugenics. And he was on that subject an absolute crank, a hack, and he would pull up his statistics, and he was clearly a provocateur and enjoyed it thoroughly. Well, anyway, he came to the university and spoke, and I went to attend. And it was a pretty full, large room. And I may misremember bits of it, but I believe everyone was sort of quiet and respectful, let him talk. Probably everyone in the room despised everything he was saying and despised him personally. They let him talk. They didn't applaud. No one stood up and turned around. No one booed. No one shouted over or had air horns or anything else. And I thought it was actually one of the better teaching moments I experienced at UVA, because we actually had a chance to hear someone who was kind of a monster. And you hear you can be awfully smart and awfully stupid at the same time. And I think we all walked out better for having attended. I don't think he could get invited now. I don't think he would be, you don't have to be that awful to be absolutely verboten on the campus at this point.
No, I think that, I certainly, it's hard to imagine someone of Shockley's perspective being invited to speak. And by the way, I think that booing and protesting is also free speech. So, if somebody says, Dr. Shockley, everything you're saying is complete BS, that's a fair thing to do. Preventing him from speaking.
And that was done in the Q&A, believe me, that there were plenty of people, but it was conversant. It wasn't speaking over. People had the chance and took advantage of it to tell him precisely what they thought of him.
Yeah, I do think there's a generational change around issues of free speech. My personal view has always been that people have if you're saying something that is stupid and harmful, the right response is to criticize that speech and say that is stupid and harmful. It is not the right response to prevent the person from making the statement. And I think I think there has been a movement away from that. I sort of associate that with the ACLU, Nazis being allowed to march in Skokie, for example, which was clearly, a revolting spectacle. But people said they're right to do that. They are horrible people doing something horrible. But and I think many people today are more ambivalent about that. But let me jump back to the Asian example in higher education for just a moment. I do think that the academic excellence of so many Asian American students, that neither side of the political spectrum quite knows how to deal with that. Because one thing that's happening is if we genuinely admitted people to elite academic institutions based on demonstrated academic skill, we would have a higher percentage of Asian American students than we have. And that's pretty obvious. And in one way you can see it's obvious is you don't see very many super mediocre Asian American students in a higher education compared to other groups of people academically. And it's not that those people don't exist, it's just they are not admitted because they're competing with each other. But the second thing is that I think American conservatives have not confronted. One of the things that's happening is it's the broader academic mediocrity of American culture that immigrants are insulated from. And one of the reasons why Jewish students and Asian American students and immigrant students from Nigeria, are excelling in many academic pursuits is they are protected from some of the stupidity of American culture, and we don't quite know how to talk about that, but that is a factor,
can you expound on that? This is a little bit of a tangent, but can you expound on
what
parts of American culture are stupid?
American youth culture does not prize academic achievement in the way that many subcultures do. And so one consequence of that is when people are in subcultures that are sort of insulated from that popular culture, in some ways they're better equipped to compete. And so, you look at, say, Stuyvesant High School in New York City, it's just hugely overrepresents Asian American students. And it is because, because they're really doing the thing. And I don't think either side of the American political spectrum quite knows how to deal with that. And I mean, I was actually kind of shocked that Harvard actually sent out mailers where they had a higher test score threshold to market Harvard for Asian American students than for white students. I was really astonished that no one, I mean, it wasn't that big a difference, but there was that no one in that process said, hey, wait a minute, you can't do that. I mean, by the way, I think you can believe in affirmative action and so on, but there's a big difference between saying we really need to make sure we have a sufficient number of African American students, that we deal with Native American students, Latinx students, to make sure that we have a fully diverse room. We don't try to constrain the number of Asian American students intentionally, and that was I do view that as something that is a very very concerning. And certainly as someone of a Jewish background, this is very familiar. It is, we've seen this movie before. Anyway, I won't take up too much of our time.
No, we have to bring Dr. Pollack back to talk about. We should just do a discussion on this. It's very interesting to talk to you. I wanted to talk a little bit. Just moving away from some of these hot button topics that are popular hot button topics, right? That are in tweets and in the media all the time. To talk about something that you have, I'm sure, some expertise in, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong. But what to do about addiction is a massive problem, correct? And there's a lot of public health spends their time thinking about this. But my question again comes to, well, how much discussion is there? Really, how much discussion is allowed around this topic? So, for instance. And again, you'll excuse me, I'm a cardiologist who's just read a little bit in preparation for this. So if I correct me for anything dumb that I say, but there's this idea that that the way to deal with drug addiction in some ways is to pursue a harm reduction strategy, right? It's this phrase called harm reduction. Now, it's very interesting. There's been some pushback I've seen from some popular folks. I think Michael Schellenberger has written a bit about this, and he's basically pushing back and saying, look, he doesn't believe harm reduction is necessarily the solution, and he doesn't think it may be saving lives. It may reduce some things. It may reduce HIV transmission. He has a nice book that talks about some of these things, but he doesn't think that it saves lives, and he doesn't think this is a public policy that governments, cities should pursue. Is that so? He thinks there should be a more coercive abstinence policy. I think that's the phrase, in terms of kind of coercing people to stop, as opposed to a harm reduction strategy, which more involves places to use drugs in a safe way. In a way,
it would be a penal strategy where there are more consequences that then would affect. I mean, I imagine that you're going to say, Anish, that would affect minorities and disadvantaged people more disproportionately,
Well,
right?
I was going to. Yeah, is that a reasonable description, Dr. Pollack, of what?
Well, let me answer that in a couple of different ways. One is, harm reduction is the question.
Right.
The question is, how do we reduce harm? And the answer is a granular answer. And it is, when someone says we need to, the answer to this is harm reduction. To me, that's like, okay, well, describe to me what you're going to do. In the case of HIV transmission, we have tremendous evidence that providing sterile syringes saves lives, slows HIV transmission. If you want to prevent roadside deaths from alcohol use, the designated driver is a harm reduction intervention, and it is very effective. Now, if you say, I'm trying to prevent people acting gross because they've drank too much, The designated driver intervention is not going to help you with that because it's not designed to reduce that harm. It's designed to reduce the harm of somebody smashing their car. And so if I'm trying to reduce drug-related crime, an intervention that reduces HIV transmission may or may not accomplish that. Now, by the way, I think that there's a couple of things I would say we need to incorporate in harm reduction. One is when you have a syringe exchange, you now have an opportunity to create a relationship with the person. And you can say, you know, I'm going to help you. I'm going to give you this sterile syringe. And I'm going to help you to protect yourself and other people from HIV while you're using heroin. This sterile syringe is only dealing with one issue that you got. First of all, I'm worried about you overdosing. But also, you know, there's a lot of challenges because you have a substance use disorder. There's a lot of other harms that are coming to you and to other people, potentially because of your heroin use. And how can we deal with that? Because, you know, most people who use heroin, they are not overjoyed. Nobody's like, you know, I always wanted to be a street heroin user when I grow up and be borderline homeless and be shoplifting from Walgreens to support my habit. And to not be welcome in my family home because I once stole my mom's credit card to buy some drugs. There's no one, I assure you, life has, any message that you want to give to people with a really serious heroin problem, life has already given them that same message. So I think harm reduction is often, you know, there's a portfolio of stuff that we're trying to do. And like people who use heroin who do not harm other people, maybe what they need is access to sterile syringes and treatment. The coerced abstinence is an effective intervention. Say when you have like the Dakota 24/7 program is a nice example where the right harm reduction intervention is actually to be testing people for alcohol. If you have someone who is driving while intoxicated or engaging in domestic violence because they're drinking too much, you know, random screening, looking for alcohol and saying, you know what, if you test positive for alcohol, you're going to spend 48 hours in the jail. And we're, you know, because you have caused harm with your drinking that we don't really know how to reduce except for to do this kind of monitoring. That's harm reduction too. And I think there's no one thing called addiction. There's no one thing called drug-related harm, and each one, the only thing that we do know is that there's human beings affected on all sides by the things that are happening. And what I like about the harm reduction approach is it says there's a human here. Right. How do we help? So that was a long answer. So let me.
No. And I again, not my space, and it's a very nice exposition of how granular topic it is and how complicated it is. But the question, I guess, my overarching question is: are folks allowed to disagree with a policy of a particular city's policy of harm reduction, which says, look, we are going to open up a safe needle exchange site. We're going to give out lots and lots of needles that are sterile. And is someone allowed to push back and say, look, we believe, right? I'm not saying, and this is not conservative, liberal. I'm saying, is somebody allowed to push back and say, we believe that what you are doing, while it may reduce HIV transmission somewhat, HIV to a large extent is controlled. The number of HIV cases the last year in San Francisco were like 170, yet there were, you know, X number, thousand overdose deaths. We think that your policy, which is, you know, good, well-intentioned and whatnot, but we think your policy is actually increasing the number of deaths related to overdose. And therefore I disagree with it. Because if somebody came to you and said those things, what would your response be?
But people do come to me and say those things.
Okay.
But I started in the syringe exchange, and one of the most important opponents of syringe exchange 30 years ago was Charles Rangel. Okay. And many people in the African American community, quite understandably, saw the shadow of Tuskegee in the syringe exchange. They're like, let me get this straight. You're not giving people addiction treatment. You're not dealing with the crime that person's going to commit, you know, mugging my aunt so that he can get $10 to get drugs. You're not here. There's a whole long list of stuff that you're not doing, but you are going to give this guy this sterile syringe so he can kind of kill himself a little bit more slowly with heroin. And by the way, Dr. Pollack, where's the syringe exchange in your neighborhood? You can imagine. I mean, that was and I think, by the way, one answer to that is to take it very seriously and to say, like what you just said, the overdose problem, we have to have a distinctive response to the overdose problem. And as we give you this sterile syringe, what are we doing in overdose prevention for you? What are we doing to give you naloxone, to educate you about overdose, to create a context where we can protect you? And then in terms of the crime issue, to say to people in the community, where can we put this syringe? Where can we put our sterile syringe facility so that somebody doesn't walk across the street and shoot up in the men's room of your restaurant? You're not a racist or a bigot if you are the restaurant owner and you're saying, wait a minute, do not set that up across the street from my restaurant because this is what it's going to do for my business. Like, we have to be pragmatic and negotiating and to say everyone involved has a legitimate interest. Now, if somebody says something that's not evidence-based, then you say, I'm sorry, but the evidence, what you're saying is incorrect. Bob, you're trying to get in. I've been filibustering.
Yeah. I was just going to say, this whole range of issues, I think, has been a big problem through the COVID pandemic, that there have been certain positions which, in retrospect, might have been more sensible than originally assumed. There's been this talking head syndrome of public health experts and other experts coming on with 100% certainty that this is the case. I mean, you could go back and forth, and let me stress, I always like to say, I'm triple vaxxed. I ran out and got them the first day. I dutifully went in my KN95 and all of that. But there were voices arguing, the most obvious one, maybe focused protection would have been a better strategy than the extremely broad-based mitigation. And at this point, I'm kind of an agnostic. I have my sort of views of what I think is the truth, but I'm also willing to say maybe I was wrong on things. The whole debate about masks and cloth masks in particular, as opposed to the more substantial ones. The cable networks were simply filled with experts who were absolutely pummeling. You need to do this. The whole controversy now with should you be requiring elementary school kids or kindergartners to wear them? And there's just a deep intolerance in asking the questions. And I think that's, again, is a mighty serious problem. And lately I've started writing more on the medical profession as opposed to public health, because public health for its entire history has been essentially a collectivist. I mean, it's focused on population health. It's what it's supposed to do. And traditionally there was something of a counterweight in the medical community, which was focused on the individual as opposed to the community. And I think that's changing. I wrote something recently and said that some steps that the American Medical Association is taking are almost turning the medical profession into a subspecialty of public health, which I think removes a really important counterweight, that a sort of a debate between medical profession and public health. And what we're getting from it is these 100% experts adamant on everything. And then when it flips over, when there's a change of view, it's, oh, well, I never felt the other way. It's kind of an Orwellian strategy. There was a fine piece in Commentary magazine this week on an exceedingly bright person from public health community, Lana Wen, who has said, well, we can change the mitigation strategies now because the science has changed. And the article was saying, no, actually the science hasn't changed. The politics have changed. And again, I think that's a deep problem, and not just a problem of discourse, but actually the things that Harold started this conversation with, which is, if you can't talk to half the people in the country, you're not going to get the sensible messages across.
There's an awful lot there. I mean, I do think that there are some unforced errors in the public health community. I think when we really lambasted the lockdown demonstrations and then embraced the BLM demonstrations. I'm not, that a lot of America just stopped listening, and that was
They did.
quite predictable, that would happen. And there's certainly mistakes, and I think that a lot of the initial masking, messaging was very poorly addressed. I must say, as a public health person, I feel, we have for decades underinvested in the American public health infrastructure. And I mean, the idea that we have a $4 trillion medical economy and we don't have enough $1 masks. And, a lot of the poor, so a lot of local public health clinics have a level of consumer service that would put that a local Domino's pizza franchise would be ashamed of, but there's a reason why, which is that it's been underfunded for decades. And people, I remember I was watching one thing where a Silicon Valley entrepreneur was explaining to public health people that they should have billion-dollar IT systems to do the inventory management for PPE and stuff like that. And, and the level of mansplaining in that was just total. Everyone in public health understands that it is a technologically lagging sector because it's been underinvested. And that's so frustrating. What we saw in COVID, I mean, one of the things that I find quite striking is even the disparity between Medicaid and public health. So, if I'm the state of Illinois and I have a choice, I can spend more money to hire outreach workers to find people at risk of HIV or of COVID and help them. Or I can spend more money, let's say at a federally qualified health center, to help poor people. If I spend another dollar at that federally qualified health center and the people that are being helped are on Medicaid, the federal government picks up at least dollar for dollar what I'm doing. If I send that public health outreach worker out there, the federal government doesn't pick up any of that additional cost. And you don't have to be an economist to understand that if there's tremendous differences at the margin in what the federal government is subsidizing, the states are going to respond. So why, if I'm the state of Illinois, I'm not setting up a big stockpile of PPE for the pandemic that might happen in 2032, because first of all, I look stupid right now because I'm spending all this money on what looks like a boondoggle, at the warehouse, but also I'm bearing 100% of the cost. And if in a sane society, we would not have such an imbalance between personal medical services and public health services in the way we finance things, because we dramatically underinvest in public health in so many ways, in a way that really is very directly linked to the way we pay for things. So,
Yeah.
Harold, would you? Sorry.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Danny.
Go ahead, Michelle.
Okay.
We'll finish it.
Would you accept a position that says, well, we want to pursue policy A as opposed to policy B, even if at the end of the day there are more deaths from the pandemic, because with policy A, we live, it reflects a certain way of living together that we think is better, even at the cost of more lives lost.
Well, I certainly think we should be open to that. I mean, we do that all the time. We could have a speed limit of 40 miles an hour on the highway, and we might have fewer deaths. And, we all say, no, that's ridiculous. I think that if we are transparent about those trade-offs, I think there are certainly a place for risk-benefit trade-offs. We don't, we're not going to spend $100 million per life saved for everything.
Right.
We just can't do that.
But the trade-offs tend to be, it's hard to put this in a calculus because we prefer this way of living together. You can't quantify that, right? I mean, we prefer not to have vaccine mandates, even if vaccine mandates, if they were imposed, would save lives. So and that's why, it goes back to my distinction. I was saying that conservatives in general are not going to be, maybe by nature, attracted to policy circles, just because this is not the way they necessarily view how we address, and that's why I think they've been more successful in law schools. You mentioned that you said the law schools were better at recruiting. I don't think the law schools were actively recruiting conservatives. I think conservatives have tried to take over and have been more successful at taking over the law schools because that's how they're interested in changing society.
Well, there's a lot of conservatives who, I mean, the idea that, I mean, if you go across corporate America, there's an awful lot of very conservative people who are making some very technocratic judgments involving billions of dollars every day. And when I think of Mitt Romney, I think of somebody. I mean,
think of him as a liberal.
I mean, he's a political conservative, and he's a techno. How many Democratic politicians have greater policy analytic skills than Mitt Romney? Not too many. And there's, and we all make these trade-offs, and we're all absolutists in some other realms. So, if we look at criminal justice, a lot of people in the public health community and the liberal community say, I want a shorter sentence for people who've committed armed robbery, even though there's a risk that some of those people who get out sooner are going to reoffend, because we want to live together in a society that doesn't brutalize people who commit crimes, and we are willing to tolerate some level of reoffending in that group. My cousin was beaten to death by a 16-year-old young man, and he got out of prison. The young man got out of prison after about 17 years. But he's not committed another crime, registered Republican, by the way, as far as I know. And I think about that, and I think, you know what, that was the right outcome. He committed an atrocity when he was 16 years old. There's some risk when he got out, in his mid-30s, that he might do something like that again. But it's not. But that risk was worth taking compared to taking a human being and keeping him in an 8x10 box for the rest of his life because he committed an atrocity when he was 16 years old. And I do think that there's a role for risk benefit. There's also a role for forgiveness. And one of the things about conservatives, many conservatives have a faith tradition that is important in their politics and includes forgiveness. A lot of conservatives have been active to, when an individual is on death row and they believe he should be given clemency. My brother-in-law is intellectually disabled, and I can tell you that when I take him on vacation, if I'm on a bus and a Hollywood, mansion tour or whatever, and there's an evangelical or a Mormon church group that's on that bus with me, someone's going to tap me on the shoulder and say, excuse me, I see you're taking care of your brother-in-law. If you just need to go to the bathroom or something, you need somebody to watch him while you do that, why don't you come join our group? Because we got 25 people and we want to help you. A lot of my liberal friends on that same bus would say, I'm so for any public policy that's going to help you. But by the way, I'm reading my book while I'm on the bus, and I'm kind of too busy to help you if you need to go to the bathroom, So, I mean, the idea that liberals are better humans than conservatives is completely ridiculous.
See, the issue with this podcast is that, it's selection bias. The folks that we're worried about never come on this podcast. So back to I wanted to finish up in terms of, so we got your response to somebody that said, you know what, I don't believe harm reduction is the way to go. Yeah. And I'm gonna read you, and I think this is the problem, is that you're not reflective, or at least please tell me that I'm wrong. Maybe what I'm gonna read to you, which is the response of a public health person to somebody asking these questions, all right, is and maybe this is the minority, and maybe Twitter just amplifies this stuff, all right? And so, in response to that, don't let these people fool you. They are just in quotes asking questions the same way anti-vaxxers do, and the burden of proof needs to stay on them and their shitty takes. People like, the person who tweeted this thread that was popular about, harm reduction and this question about, whatever. People like, I'm not going to name her name, really know the audience they want, and it's bigoted and terrible. This person, Michelle, reached out to this public health person via DM and said, would you like to come speak on my podcast about how to get people off fentanyl and meth and what you think San Francisco should do? The response: I'm going to have to say no because you have been nothing but disingenuous and eagerly and heavily pushing a very false narrative while also being very resistant to correction on the topics. I don't think your podcast would even be worth my time. The burden of proof on the person making the claim. You claim harm reduction doesn't work. Prove it. All you've done is dog whistle to right-wingers and bigots. I am an addiction doctor, a toxicologist, and drug and addiction scientist. If you think you're worthy of my time, then prove yourself. So I mean, and again, the person who is writing these questions is actually a registered Democrat and is voted. At least that's what she says. And she seems to have relatively moderate positions. But that response, you see, and it's the same. It's the shades of that Ilya Shapiro thing, right? Which is the moment you disagree, you must be bigoted. You must be terrible. You, of course, are just saying that the other side is not bigoted and terrible. So, I'm not trying to put you on the spot because you clearly don't think that. But do you feel like that those comments is that reflective of the wider public health community? Because if it is, then yeah, I mean, what Dr. Grayboy said in that last line of his nice essay in response, public health, heal thyself before we move any further, is particularly appropriate.
Well, everybody's human, and the human. I will say, I mean, there's a strain of absolutism in public health. It doesn't come from nothing. One of the challenges that we have is, we have borne witness to a lot. And I mean, when I think about the HIV epidemic, the basic humanity of men who have sex with men, of people who inject drugs, was very much in question. And many people, particularly people slightly older than myself, we, witnessed real carnage and witnessed a society that really had a very ambivalent commitment to the equal humanity of a lot of the populations that we care about in public health. And we certainly see that today, with look at the crack epidemic, things like that. Many of us in public health have seen profound harm and injustice directed at the people that we are trying to help. And of course that generates a lot of anger. Now, I think that I think we have to use that anger in a judicious way. And I don't think, by the way, it's effective public health practice to tell people to F off when they ask questions, because, first of all, people aren't going anywhere. The questions are still going to be there, and you've just alienated people. I think I think, for example, a lot of the work that I'm doing now involves people with serious mental illness and substance use disorders who get into fights with first responders or have a violence issue. And, we have to deal with the reality that there are people with these behavioral health challenges who pose a public safety challenge. And there's a 60-year-old mom who's got a 28-year-old son who's got a behavioral health problem, and she's worried that he's going to punch her in the face. And I want to honor her humanity while I'm honoring the humanity of that 28-year-old man, and make sure that if she calls 911, that he doesn't end up getting shot because he's got a serious mental health problem. And I guess I think that there's a lot of people have a lot of reasons to be angry, and it's human. And so I try not to be absolutist. And
you feel those comments though are reflect? I mean, is that like? Do you feel like that is what the public health community is going to respond with? It certainly feels like me on the outside that you have to be very, very, very careful around public health officials in terms of saying.
I mean, I think
that's
why
you didn't describe a public health official. You described a random person.
Sorry, he's a addiction doctor, public health. I mean, he sees himself as part of your community.
I mean, this is not a person who has any. This is a person who is publicly saying "F you." It's not a person who's saying you're fired. It's not a person who is using their power to harm you. It's a person who is emphatically criticized.
Okay.
And there is a difference there. Someone who doesn't want to come on a show. It's not someone who says, "I'm going to shut your show down. I'm going to prevent your book from being in the school library," or anything like that. And so I do think you have to distinguish, you have to be strong enough to say, this person criticized me in very acerbic terms. I gotta kind of be tough and be able to take that and respond to it. But even as we say, civility would be kind of nice. And, people can be more civil and less absolutist. These are a lot of the people that one of the striking things about academia is it's the one place in American life where the left really has power, and almost every other arena, the left does not have power. And it is sort of striking that, in corporate America, you want to get fired for saying the wrong thing, go work for Exxon and start saying, oil companies are really burning up the planet because of irresponsible policies about climate change, and they really shouldn't have covered up a lot of what they knew about, climate change for 30 years. You would not last very long at that job if you said that. If you are if you're in the police department in many places across the United States, and you say, we have a really serious racism problem in many police departments in the United States, you're very likely to get fired or worse in those settings. So, any place where a group of people have power, they are tempted to abuse it and to justify that. And, there is in academia, we do have, the left is in a position where the left can sometimes do that. Lots of other arenas in America, it's the right that's doing that. So anyway.
Bob, we need to wrap up here, but I'll let you, maybe it's unfair because it's going to be at least a loaded question. Do you think, so Bob, a question to you, do you think Harold's invitation to have more conservatives in his circles is so that he can then persuade more conservatives to take vaccines and abide by the left-wing mandates? Or is it to really be informed by conservative thoughts?
I try not to look into the souls of anybody, since I'm not even sure what's lurking in mine. But my problem that I enunciated in the article was that Harold's intentions are good, and if all the public health professors were like Harold, I think you would have more conservatives in there, and you would have a much more open environment. It's just I think he's an outlier. Again, I've been in graduate schools for decades, and there has been a change in fairly recent years, and I think a marked change. What I find in universities, as well as on Twitter or anywhere else, we have change in the mode of conversation. People have given up on empathy, on forgiveness, on proportionality. So you make a tiny error, you should be fired and destroyed and chased away from civil society. There's no statute of limitations. If you said something bad when you were 12 years old, it's coming back to bite you. There's no due process. It's go on the cable and attack immediately. And there's no ex post facto prohibition. So you can be pilloried for something that was perfectly acceptable when you did it, but now it's not. So retroactively, you're an awful person. And I think in some ways, the university has become the hot center of these problems, that universities always thought of themselves as the most tolerant place on the planet. And to some extent, that was justified. If you thought of Berkeley 50 years ago and the Berkeley free speech movement, yeah, you could say anything you wanted, and that was the ideal. Now I think it's flipped 180 degrees, and the campus is one of the most dangerous places to speak your mind now, especially if you need your dissertation signed or if you need your paycheck signed. So I think it's an enormous problem for the integrity of science, integrity of peer-reviewed literature.
But so maybe the solution is not necessarily that conservatives come into the hallowed halls of public health, but they make their own institutions.
Well,
that's
conservatives have to raise their game if they're going to do that, because one of the reasons why there are so few conservatives in academia is because there is a real problem that the education gradient in American politics is a real thing. By the way, I would say I would take both of the above for my hidden agenda. I want to learn from conservatives, and I want more conservatives vaccinated. And I am definitely going to go over inclusive.
That would be my guess.
Yeah, I got to say, I'm in Philadelphia, and I ran a vaccine clinic in March to May of last year, and it was really great. I'm a cardiologist, so a lot of my patients are super ill and would certainly benefit. So, and we vaccinated a whole number of people, and there's this there's the regulatory requirements to keep vaccines as a private practice solo practice doctor are a little much. You have to like every day upload 2 different things to 2 different sites about how many vaccines you use and stuff. I understand why it's done to keep track of these precious commodity and stuff, but just anyway. And on top of that, if you don't use at least 10 10 shots per vial, you have 10 shots per vial, then you have to report now to a separate thing. So I was really incentivized not to use 10 to every vial that I opened, right? If you opened a vial, you had 6 hours to use all 10 of those shots. So I would, I would walk around with a bag around Philadelphia. I think within a mile radius, I must have hit every business. And at some point I was randomly asking people on the street if they would like a vaccine. But I got to say, and reflective of what happened in Philadelphia, which is, Philadelphia is massively blue, I don't know, 90% Democrat or something like that in the city. The folks that just said, keep walking, I don't want anything to do with you. They were almost entirely, there's no MAGA hat wearing folks in Center City, Philadelphia. They're almost entirely, Black. And unfortunately, I've lost some patients. And unfortunately they were, sick, and again, from a mostly from the Black community, unfortunately. So certainly it's interesting that, one of the fails of public health was, yes, in rural, poor areas where, many folks had a very high mortality rate and stuff. And, but also the other place, which was very interesting, which I'm not entirely, I don't entirely understand, is, these large sections of, again, predominantly Democrat,
I think that
Black sections.
No, absolutely. And on the west side of Chicago, same thing. And people have reasons to distrust the medical system, the public health community. Tuskegee is a real memory, and it is, and we have to. And I must say, a lot of people are also uncomfortable that President Trump was so enthusiastic, and Operation Warp Speed as a name freaked out a lot of people. There were, people, that's very, very human. And we have to embrace everybody. And in fact, I do worry, and I have to be careful not to contribute to that problem myself. The more we emphasize the partisan divide in vaccines, the more we may make that a self-fulfilling thing. And we have to be careful about that.
And in my piece that I wrote, I'm not quite sure that I trust the polling, in that there is a big problem that people on the right don't answer polls. Again, I don't think of myself as any hard writer, but I don't answer polls because I don't know who these people are on the phone, and I don't want to talk to them. And if you even in the article, I looked at I guess it was Kaiser had some surveys.
Yeah, we've done surveys too. Yeah.
If you look at the variation, the confidence interval, you had conservatives, or you had Republicans, and they did intersect with Latinos, with African Americans, whatever. So I'm not sure we know that there's as much. I don't think there's as much difference in reality as there are in the polls.
There's a couple of things, though. First of all, a lot of the slowness in the non-white Democratic stuff has come back. But also, if you just look at the deaths in counties by Trump voter share, there's a huge disparity in COVID deaths, and that is. And if you just look, you just go to when I talk to people in our hospital, and I just say, okay, who's in the ICU right now from COVID? It's a real thing.
And I know what you're saying, and I know those data. And actually, I I may have mentioned in that, I don't think I mentioned it in this article, but I have wondered aloud whether you might have some sort of a Simpsons paradox problem for math guys. So if you look at a heavily Trump county and you find, yes, there's a whole lot of deaths there. If you were to break that county down into the many Trump voters and the few Biden voters, is there actually a difference in the death rates among the Biden voters in the Trump county and the Trump voters in the Trump county?
I don't think there's any. That is certainly, you're right that there's a potential for some sort of weird compositional issue, but I don't think there's any evidence that that's happening. I think. Well,
and I have just wanted someone. I'm not the person to do it. I wanted someone to tear into those numbers and ask those questions, because I think it's entirely possible. And I remember there was a guy who was posting really nice little charts. He was sort of the one, I forget his name. He was the one who started posting these very nice graphics showing
Charles Gaba.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And he said, well, I'm getting some strange things that in these very heavily African-American counties in Mississippi and Alabama, these seem to act more like Trump counties. And why is that? And which started me thinking, well, maybe the problem is it's not Trumpness or Bidenness, it's Alabama-ness, and that there might not be the difference between the racial groupings that we're associating with it.
I mean, it's certainly, the world has many, there's a multivariate thing going on, and there's other pockets, but it is a fact that there's a big conservative gap, and it is causing a huge number of deaths. And that's one of the failures, and that's that's just a fact. It's not the only disparity that's going on, but it is it's
right.
quite something, and it's
which is really an odd thing. I've actually sort of marveled at it, that Donald Trump's ego, it would have thought, okay, whatever one thinks of Trump, this thing did come out under his administration, and there were 3 very big policy decisions that somebody in the administration made. First, that they were going to spend vast amounts of money. Second, that they were going to give these things away for free to anyone who wanted it. And the third one, which you may know, I don't know of any precedent in it, which was to tell the manufacturers, we're going to start buying them before the FDA approves. And if the FDA says no, we will have lost the money and you throw it out, but we're going to start buying it. Hence, the moment the FDA it was out there, and I would have thought in a normal world that someone with Trump's ego would have said, "Look what I did," and pull his supporters along.
Think of how many lives would have been saved if he just walked out with a MAGA mask and sold it for $10 on the web. I mean, I'm honestly astonished that he never did that.
I'm too.
I mean,
but here's the thing, though. I speak to Trump voters, and I've told them, some of them, again, it's a relative. It's to a physician, it seems a relative no-brainer that if you're high risk, over 55, certainly with comorbidities, oh my goodness, and it's a relative no-brainer. I've talked to folks like that who are Trump voters, who come in with a MAGA mask, and I say, why wouldn't you get the vaccine? Trump literally was all in on the vaccine. Trump got infected, recovered, and then got the vaccine. Right? He was one of the first, I think, but even before he left the White House or whatever, he got it.
He got booed.
So why? Right. So why? Right. So why aren't you getting that? So it is entirely plausible, and I think it may be more possible that there's a strain of folks that are not going to wear masks or going to vaccinate themselves, regardless of what Donald Trump is saying. And
absolutely.
And it's not that Donald Trump is leading them per se. It's that this was a group of folks that chose Donald Trump because he was anti-establishment at the time, and anti-conservative establishment, anti-democrat establishment. So, in that group of folks, don't necessarily care whether Donald Trump is vaccinating himself, giving you the vaccine, or wearing a mask. So
I think there's definitely something to that. Although I also do think that we are very tribal, and we queue on opinion elites.
Yeah.
And there's a ton of political science literature where you sort of say, what do you think of sending a person to the moon? And then the other question is, what do you think of George Bush's plan to send people to the moon? And of course, the second one, all the Democrats say no, and all the Republicans say yes. And it is, that's just.
But to your point, I think it would engender a lot more trust in those people if they did not see public health as a monolith. Like if everyone didn't say the same thing, right? If everyone didn't say masks didn't work first, then everyone didn't say masks work.
No,
or if there was actual disagreement allowed about, you know what, I don't believe with this vaccine. I mean, look, the vaccine trials, right? The initial vaccine trials were based on whether or not you had symptomatic or symptomatic positive, right? They weren't powered for understandable reasons, for reasons that anyone who is in the space understands. Given there was a pandemic going on, we wanted something to get rolled out quickly. We didn't want to wait for 4 more months until there was a death endpoint. There was a death endpoint hit or an ICU endpoint hit, right? Now we understand that, and that there's a leap there, right? But because there's nobody out there that is really allowed to say that about, well, hey, we don't know for sure. And I think if you had more of those voices out there that were prominent, unlike the current appetite to say, if they say that, that's dangerous and we need to get them off, get their podcast, canceled or whatnot. If you allowed more of that fractious kind of debate to happen in public, my bet is, this is completely speculative, my bet is that we would probably get more buy-in from different corners of the public. So
no, I think that's probably true. I mean,
which goes to your point. Yeah.
By the way, I think if we had a replacement level Republican under Trump, now it's true that I think Trump does deserve credit for the vaccine. I mean, and some of the things that Bob described, I think that was genuinely the greatest achievement of the Trump administration. And I think if we had George W. Bush as president, that we would have had a much better response. You ever see the videos of Barack Obama and George W. Bush describing their greatest anxiety in public health? They're like a respiratory agent coming from Asia, and they basically outlined exactly what happened.
Yeah,
and
or Dr. Pollack, it would have been the case that the pandemic would have happened under George Bush, and the left would have leapt on it as a way to kind of cudgel him as a racist, as they did in the Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, right? I mean, again, how do you reconcile these things? He's a wonderful man who did PEPFAR. It was him that did PEPFAR, right?
PEPFAR was his great achievement.
Yeah, and so how do you reconcile this? And I remember being, Kanye, and I remember all that. It's because he's a racist. So,
he was in it.
My
George
cynical
W.
bet.
Bush,
yeah.
Well, first of all, I mean, George W. Bush. I mean, there was the Iraq War. There were a few little things going on.
Yeah.
But no, I think on public health, George W. Bush is someone that really is concerned about public health and would have very much tried to do the right thing and would have consulted with. I mean, by the way, George
did on AIDS, as you pointed out.
Yeah, I mean, he did that. Yeah, he did that with PEPFAR, and also, by the way, his father was, of course, the great disciple of Tony Fauci. And before Tony Fauci actually came to my class at the University of Chicago years ago, and he talked about how George H.W. Bush once came to his office when he was vice president. He said, "Dr. Fauci, I think I'm going to be president someday. Can you teach me about AIDS, this AIDS thing?" And there were a bunch of things that George H.W. Bush, he had a mixed record on AIDS, by the way, as president, and he did not want to put social conservatives were an important part of his base, and he did not want to have his fingerprints on some of the things that needed to be done. But one of the things that George H.W. Bush sometimes did is he would let the Democrats do something that was an effective public health response on AIDS, and he would let them sort of put it into legislation that, like must sign legislation, or he let things happen that he didn't identify with, but that he might have stopped and chose not to. And I mean, I really do think that it is. I mean, you never know. If we can get on Earth 2, we could test all kinds of different scenarios.
Well, if Hurricane Katrina was a simulation of what would happen, I mean, again, it's pretty obvious that I think it's obvious that George W. Bush was not a racist.
No, he was not. He was not a racist.
But he certainly was cast
saw the real racists come along. By the way, we genuinely saw the difference. I honestly think, just straightforwardly, Donald Trump, Barack Obama's birth certificate is.
We'll have to wait for 20 years now, won't we, before we know for sure whether Donald Trump is a racist?
No, we know that right now.
We know that right now.
No, that's I mean, when you have civil rights
A lot of people
litigation,
knew it about George Bush too. And
no, the difference. No, no,
Yeah.
I think one of the
I-
problems that American conservatives have is really there is a straightforwardness to the unworthiness of President Trump that just has to be acknowledged. And that the left's critique of the right as having a substantial strain of people that are either racist or appealing to racism, that actually is true. Now, that does not mean that everything that people on the American right say can be tarred with that brush or should be dismissed, but it is, you know, that is a fact about American political history that that needs to be acknowledged. And conservatives would have greater credibility with liberals. When I look at, say, the Never Trump conservatives, I say, you know, those are the people that liberals really need to understand. These are people that actually are conservatives, and they are also people who have stood up at great personal sacrifice often, you know, against the unworthiness that is one strain of the American conservative movement, and we got to respect those people.
Well, to wrap up, I hope we can in the future argue about things like who's worthy and who's unworthy, and not you know, and still have a public voice.
Yeah, well, you know, what I think we've been straightforward with each other in this conversation.
No, and it's lovely. It's lovely to have you on. And Dr. Grabo is a fantastic essay in response as well. So really, thanks to both of you.
Thanks for joining us. That was delightful, and we'll have the links to your articles in the show notes.
Thank you so much, and I look forward, Dr. Grabo, for some new music that you produce.
You can sign up, subscribe to my YouTube channel.
There you go.
Good night, gentlemen.
I need 1,000 followers to monetize.